Our next speaker is Catherine Hamilton, Meg Beck and Vivienne Ivory from WSP. So I can welcome them to the stage, and whilst I'm doing that, I'll read out their introduction. The government sees the foundations of post-COVID-19 tourism shifting to a regenerative model. We have an opportunity to strengthen the burgeoning shift to a model that better reflects the authentic values of our people and places. Catherine, Meg and Vivienne from WSP will present 4 case studies that will show how landscape architecture supports the transition to regenerative tourism. Please welcome them to the stage.
Right. Kia ora tātou. Ngā mihi nui ki a tātou kua hui mai nei. Ko Meg, rātou, ko Catherine Hamilton, right, ko Vivienne Ivory on the big screen, nā ingoa. So I'm Meg, this is Catherine, and we have Vivienne from WSP Research, beaming in also from Petone today. We're going to take you on a journey with some pretty pictures and a video, but I'll pass it to Catherine to give us the roadmap.
Kia ora koutou, ko Catherine Hamilton tuku ingoa. We are going to take you on a road trip to have a look at the growing pains of tourism in Aotearoa, New Zealand. We're going to start by looking at the genesis of mass tourism, and then moving through to a tipping point, and then to a regeneration, a reset of tourism that moves towards a regenerative model based on the authentic values of people and place. We're going to look at 4 case studies, and Vivienne's going to beam in and remotely talk to us about some international exemplars. We can trace the burgeoning of mass tourism back to the Edwardian era, where at the turn of the 20th century, Aotearoa was sold as the Britain of the South Seas. Underlying this British gaze was the exotification and stereotyping of our scenic landscapes, of Māori, and it was a patronising commodification of landscape and culture with little thought of returning value back to people and place. In other words, it was an extractive model rather than a regenerative structure. Shout out to my mum up there on the left-hand side. In 1902, travel agency Thomas Cook published a guide. Actually, I might need to go back one. Yeah. In 1902, travel agency Thomas Cook published a guide for tourists seeking to experience untouched beauty. Seductive language and chocolate box images were used to sell the dream. Descriptions such as superlative landscape, majestic mountain ranges, stupendous glaciers were used to tout Aotearoa as paradise, the 8th wonder of the world according to Rudyard Kipling. The visitor experience back then was packaged, it was slow, typically 2 months, easy to tour and relatively affordable for many. The rise of mass tourism continued throughout the 20th century. In the earlier decades, there was still a slower experience, appealing to Kiwis as a more immersive experience, and to international markets as more of a luxury product. As travel became cheaper and more expedient, people could afford to take a holiday in New Zealand. There was a greater appeal to wider international markets, and transport was easier. People no longer needed to rely on coaches and trains and cruise liners. As travel became cheaper and more expedient, we then saw this rise in tourism, and we reached a tipping point. And so by the beginning of the 21st century, we had reached this point where tourism had become one of New Zealand's biggest export industries. Being a great export earner disguised a worrying reality. That is, that we have been giving Aotearoa away, a race to the bottom in economic terms. Terrible slogans such as "find a better price and we'll beat it by 10" started to slather our buses and aligned our most precious landscapes with benign bargain basement mass retail offerings. Our own landscapes became places that felt possessed and overrun by people seeking an Instagram moment, a hurried trip driven by an impulse to experience scenic beauty and adventure. But in reality, the monetarised value of 100% pure New Zealand largely headed offshore and did not accrue in any significant measure back to local people, place and landscapes.
So, a tipping point. When it comes to research, we like our research to be replicable, and that's where Butler's model is really great. Butler came up with this in the 80s, but it's been replicated many, many times since then in different cultures across different countries. So what Butler's theorem tells us is that generally tourism will start in an area based on a really lovely primary attraction. That primary attraction might be landscape, it might be culture, it might be a combination of the two. And this attracts the people. As it moves into a development stage, locals become involved, and there might be the odd secondary attraction like offering like maybe a guest house, but definitely no water slides or stuff like that. However, we go up into the development phase, we start to move up, and that's when it starts to really get busy. The big international conglomerates move in, there tends to be a homogenisation of the product. There's a lot of separation of the locals from their land, and like Catherine said, those funds are not accrued back into the village or the area. They tend to go offshore. The number of tourists exceeds the number of locals. In a lot of cases, the primary attraction becomes degraded, and people become unhappy. But the good news is lots of other attractions sort of have been built. You've got your water slide if you're into that sort of thing. Dare we say the word tourist trap? And this is what happens is then that's where it goes wrong. We reach the tipping point, and pretty much generally you've got one of two options: rejuvenation, or you just carry on down. Rejuvenation is strongly linked to reduction of the carrying capacity, to regeneration of the primary attraction, which is generally the landscape, and to reconnection to the culture. Now, there's one other option that Butler identified, and that's a sudden decline. That's generally caused by political unrest, catastrophe, or disease. So, sounds familiar?
So, COVID-19 disruption hit the tourism industry hard. It shifted rapidly from an unsustainable and overcrowded state to having the bottom fall out pretty much overnight. The unforeseen pandemic exposed the vulnerability of an industry that was so heavily reliant on overseas visitors and volume. Domestic tourism took centre stage. We started to see slogans like "See your own backyard" and "Do something new, New Zealand," encouraging Kiwis to visit our familiar and loved places. And we can expect continued sporadic disruption to the international visitor market, with loss and uptick in visitor numbers as megatrends such as climate change and pandemics continue to redefine the visitor economy. So the question is, how do we build a new structure for tourism that is inherently more resilient and more enriching? So central government and mana whenua partners, advised by key stakeholders such as tourism operators, have developed a strategy to deliver a regenerative model. And you can find this here on MBIE's website. And this is really aimed at transforming the foundations of the tourism system. And core to that structure is that it gives back more than it takes. The strategy is given effect through regional destination management plans that you'll find around the country. This regenerative approach has a vision of delivering productive, sustainable and inclusive tourism growth, and places partnerships with Māori tourism enterprise, iwi, hapu and tangata whenua at its core. The focus of this approach is on supporting thriving regions, economic improvement, delivering exceptional visitor experiences, protection of te tao and improvement to the lives of New Zealanders in our communities. And I think we might have Vivienne beaming in from afar now.
So we're not alone. What we are seeing in New Zealand has been playing out internationally, with pressures on environments, people, communities and carbon. Some examples: Maya Bay in Thailand was closed due to severe over-tourism that was destroying the very environment that people were coming to see. In Venice and the US national parks have all with extreme visitor numbers. But Maya Bay is now reopened with different structures in place, reflecting a renewed focus on valuing the environment over people. And other countries are making shifts towards regenerative, more sustainable tourism models. So what are the lessons from afar that can be applied here? And where are the opportunities for real change and what's needed to support them? So using one research example of a shift towards sustainable agritourism, David Lammy and colleagues highlight the role played by networks and collaboration to bring about change and social innovation in rural areas. In Italy, agritourism has moved beyond the food plus accommodation model to one that's about social innovation. Models such as social farms offer the opportunity for education, local revitalisation, and social inclusion. So agritourism here is about connecting people, tourists and employees, with farming through education and employment and helping to revitalise rural areas. In the US, the next generation of farmers are often coming from non-farming backgrounds, and they're bringing with them their environmental values and social values that mean they want to do things differently. For them, agritourism is a natural response to their desires for local food systems and is a valid enterprise they can build their brand around. By collaborating with others, they can develop a critical and economically viable mass of agritourism events and activities. In Argentina, agritourism integrates farm with village-scale tourism. And policies and institutions support the organisation of resources to provide a local tourist offer that includes local food processing and consumption. They also support the building of networks between farms and villages and promoting that social innovation and collaboration. In France, there's extensive networks of farmers and associated agritourism providers that are supported by national and regional structures, coordinating businesses, providing advice, quality control, practical assistance, and brand promotion. In these examples, the formal structures such as policies, funding, organisations, and the informal ones of collaborations and networks have worked together to enable change and reflect the values of agritourism providers in their communities. If we leave the pre-COVID mass tourism structures in place, tourism will return to the past because that's what's easiest. That's what the structures support. So Catherine and Meg are going to show us some cases where the structures themselves have changed to enable this regenerative tourism.
Thank you, Vivienne. So we're just going to take the last part of this presentation to take a trip around Aotearoa and show you some case studies where the regenerative structure is starting to take place. So these will highlight different complexions of a regenerative approach, one that prioritises value and values over volume. So we're going to start in the south. At Piopiotahi, Milford Sound, structural change was needed to address overcrowding. By 2018, Milford Sound had become Aotearoa's #1 attraction, with particular appeal to overseas visitors. But it was suffering from over-tourism. Predictions were that by the following year, 900,000 tourists would visit the Sound, which was unsustainable. A governance group was set up, reflecting a true partnership between central government and Ngāi Tahu, to determine a new way of delivering a world-class visitor experience that would protect the values of people and place. A series of 7 pillars were developed to guide the future of Milford Sound as a destination to protect its place in the wider landscape of Te Waipounamu Fiordland National Park, which is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and to accrue value to the region. Using the analogy of a stereoscope, viewing Milford Sound from different angles of people and place and visitor experiences creates depth and solidity. Both are vital. And shout out to Jack Hill for this wonderful artwork. A landscape architecture-led master plan was prepared. This was presented to Cabinet Ministers by the chair of the governance group, Ngāi Tahu, and myself. We were able to convince the government to fund further stages of the Milford Opportunities project, and so the transformation to a regenerative model continues.
Unlike Piopiatahi Milford Sound, which is well established, our next case study is a new enterprise. Whoop. Apologies. In this case, the idea is that at business case level, the values of the people will be built in right from the start. So the offering is a 3-day walk through the most amazing landscape. So it goes past lakes, over the top of Tararuo Maunga, and past more lakes and along a beautiful thermal valley. The governance of it is a kawanata of 3 iwi, so Ngāti Tarafa, Ngāti Rangatihi and Tūharangi. And the idea is to build in their values, which you can see up here. Now, this is not a business as usual case. They wanted new thinking, which aligned. Don't just ignore the little text because that's not what this is about. What we want to show you is that the timeline goes all the way from Te Pō. The timeline acknowledges their connection to Ranginui and Papatuanuku as their ancestors. The timeline also acknowledges that this area was the birthplace of tourism, of the beautiful image that Catherine's already shown you of the pink and white terraces. But there was a disconnection that happened after the Tararuo eruption. That disconnection now is being followed by a reconnection, which is supported by a treaty settlement and allowing them to come back onto their land. The timeline looks all the way into the multiple generations of the future and how this will provide for them. So because this was a single-stage business case, we really needed to build those values in economic terms. So those values became critical parts of the multi-criteria analysis. Again, shout out to Chrissy Morohu for these amazing graphics. So because those values were given economic weighting, they got to build these in, and that helped them sort of analyse the different offerings that were up. I mean, it is so beautiful, there's already pressure on them to make it a great walk. However, their key ideas, as one of the matua said, is that we have a common responsibility to taiao, welcoming people as manihiri to our place, asking them to share the responsibility of taking care of it. So the lockdowns, one of them found my husband and myself and our small dog, Ginger Rogers, as caretakers of the Hamner Springs Hotel. It's an iconic Spanish mission building in a small town. It was a big empty hotel. My husband was crouched most of the time anxiously typing into a laptop, and it was nothing like The Shining. I'm joking, it was exactly like The Shining. But what we can't deny is that COVID-19 brought a lot of pain to the tourism industry and to the smaller regional towns that it supports. So when we were asked by the people of the previous project, what could make it resilient? Well, it's a really important question to us as well. And the thing is, things that we've noticed is that some of these regional areas bounce back very quickly, including Hamner Springs and also Kaitiritiri, which actually in 2020 and 2021 had a reasonably healthy profit, despite the fact that the borders were closed, and for a lot of that, the unfortunate people of Auckland were completely locked up as well. So the Kaitiritiri Recreational Reserve, it's probably bigger than what you think. It's an absolutely pristine, blue waters, Golden Bay, very iconic New Zealand campground, mountain bike park, and if you have the opportunity to go there while you're down here, absolutely do. It's beautiful. So it's actually a Crown Reserve, which is run by a board which has been appointed by the Minister of Conservation, and it's entirely self-funding. But again, the challenge is a master plan. So how does the Kaitiritiri Recreational Reserve respond to the challenges that we might see in the future, but also retain this quintessential connection to people and place, or build on that even, which we feel makes it resilient to the changes of the future?
Thanks, Meg. So the last case study we're going to talk to is Rākau Rangatira, and this is a partnership between Department of Conservation and Te Rōroa, and it was set up to protect Te to Ngāhere or Waipoa, which is the forest up north in the Hokianga, and to create value for Te Roroa. Waipoa Forest, the home of Tāne Mahuta, has long been a major visitor attraction, but incredibly, up until now, people have had unfettered access to that forest. They haven't had to pay and go and visit this majestic forest. Visitor experiences will in the future be founded on the principle of forest comes first. The key intention is to protect the Ngāhere and to delight the visitors and to benefit the region. And, just back. So these are the po that were established to hold up the project. Central to that is recognition of Te Roroa's mana, kaitiakitanga and tikanga over Ngāhere o Waipoa. The project is motivated by the need to protect the forest from the ravages of Kodi dieback. Biosecurity is paramount, and therefore control of visitors as vectors of the pathogen is also paramount. The reshaping of the visitor experience will consist of a hosted journey through the forest. A boardwalk with stopping moments will accommodate ambassador-led groups, Te Roroa ambassador-led groups of no more than 20 people at a time, and people will be required to pay for this experience. So design is being delivered through a co-design process with Te Roroa appointed artists playing a central role. Cultural narratives provided by Te Roroa will authentically represent the unique quality and history of Te Ngāhere, elevate the experience for visitors, and enhance the mana of Waipoa. So what are some of the key takeouts? Tourism structures are changing to an equal partnership approach from that extractive approach that we saw right back at the genesis of mass tourism. Structures can enable collaboration, less separation of people from the tourism product. And change can happen when the structures in place reflect our values and prioritise value and values over volume. And finally, landscape architecture demonstrably has a really important role to play in enabling this shift to a regenerative approach. So we'd just like to finish with a video, and thanks for your time.
you.